Hi, everyone. My name is Bill French. I'll be speaking on the Green New Deal, constructing a climate security industrial complex. Mitigating climate change is our top national global security threat. My presentation is rooted in ethical theory, national security studies, and American history. I'm neither a scientist nor an engineer, but I'm deeply grateful for your critically important work that you all are doing. I have 5 main points in a proposal. First, I want to focus on the asymmetry of threat perception and response. It leads to entrenched high military spending, but an ignoring a lack of a sense of urgency when it comes to ecological threats. Second, I sketch some of the recent national history. In the early 70s, we had a broad national bipartisan consensus that environmental pollution and other ecological concerns were serious harms. Beginning in Reagan's presidency, however, Republican national circles began to frame environmental regulations as drags on our economy, jobs creation, and thus often harmful to our communities. We now see a wide split between Republicans and Democrats regarding the seriousness of climate change. This has been dragged in quite dangerously into our cultural wars. Third, I discussed the grand vision of a Green New Deal, calling for massive building up of solar and wind power capacity and the production of jobs to promote economic equity in our country. Fourth, I sketched the history of America's mobilization of national strength to join in helping to win World War II. This is a model of what a sense of urgency and a scale of action is now needed to engage mounting climate change. Fifth, Eisenhower famously warned us in 1961 of the incessant lobbying power of the military-industrial complex. But we need to remember in 1941, construction of this complex was critical to winning the war. My proposal, we got to apply national energy through building a climate security industrial complex to commit $1 trillion per year to fund climate security. This fund is comparable to our current annual military spending. Applied energy for this conference mostly means solar, wind, geothermal, and nuclear. Applied national energy means economics and politics. It means pushing political election victories to push for mobilization. Applied corporate and labor energy harnesses powerful big business interests in profits and labor interests in jobs to push congressional interests in re-election. The goal, steps to a Green New Deal. Terribly violent recent years, violence in terms of weather and climate disasters. Last year was globally the third costliest year on record, $343 billion. For the United States, we saw 688 of our citizens killed and costs of $145 billion in 2021. Code Red for Humanity, says the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The double standard of threat perception. Silo A, traditional national security understanding, high military spending. The assumption is only military threats really count. Silo B, ecological concerns. There's low climate security spending assumption. Ecological threats don't really rise to the level of the seriousness of national security threats. There's an asymmetry of threat level demanded for action. When it comes to military threats, the threshold for action is the merest possibility of threat, from maybe North Korea or Iran or whatever. Prudence dictates then the worst case scenario planning. We have to be prepared for the worst. Well, we as a nation apply that to our military spending, but it's lacking in our ecological perspectives of threat. There, the threshold for action has been placed by the right wing as certitude regarding the scale of the threat. So we always need more scientific study. We always lack sound science. So it's best case scenario reasoning, planning for the best case, and that means you're not really prepared. Sorry about that. Sketch of recent presidential stances. Richard Nixon, Republican president. In 69, the Cuyahoga River catches on fire. We have our first Earth Day in 1970, signifying the peoples of the world are beginning to get concerned. Nixon signs into being the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, and he signs the Endangered Species Act in 73. He's a very substantial, ecologically responsible president. Jimmy Carter. The Yom Kippur War had triggered an Arab oil embargo of the United States, triggering a huge energy crisis in the United States. Carter creates the Department of Energy in 1977. He starts tax credits for homeowners to install solar water heaters. And he put them on the White House. There they are. Trying to model good behavior. Ronald Reagan, Republican president, pushed to grow the economy via tax cuts and deregulation in environmental areas. He clobbered big labor unions by firing the air traffic controllers. He begins to roll back Carter's environmental regulations, and he took a very pro-development stance, viewing environmental regulations as burdens on the economy and communities. To this day, that is the tune of many Republican national leaders. He did support the Montreal Protocol banning CFCs. And when there was a roof leak and the solar panels needed to be pulled off, Reagan didn't want them put back on. Symbolics. Bill Clinton, Democrat, had a broad stance of strengthening lots of regulations, expanding the protection of federal lands, extending protection of species, pushing the auto industry to achieve higher miles per gallon on fuel efficiency. He expanded tax credits for solar and wind power. He called climate change an existential threat. He negotiates and signs the Kyoto Protocol to deal with global warming. He pushed for a modest gas tax and a BTU tax, but they didn't pass. George W. In his 2000 campaign, he favored mandatory limits on carbon emissions, but when he became president, tossed out that promise. It's kind of a case and study of the demand for certitude of the scale of climate change before we do anything. He argued the Kyoto Protocol is fatally flawed. There are too many scientific uncertainties about climate change. We need sound science on which to base sound policy. I just felt the Kyoto Treaty was unrealistic. It was not based upon science. Barack Obama, Democratic president. In his years, climate change no longer could be treated as a minor concern. Climate change became a major security priority for him and for the rest of the world. It was not his initial top priority. Fracking allowed US to surge oil and natural gas production, and this helped undercut the coal industry. Coal-fired power plants shifted to natural gas. Many coal companies began to go bankrupt. Obama attended the Copenhagen Climate Summit. Many were disheartened by its failure to come to any significant conclusion. In 2014, President Barack Obama and China's president broke with a stalemate that had stood for years, where China and India and Brazil and others refused to accept any caps on their coal and oil use. They said their top priority is to help grow their economy, to lift their people out of poverty. That just was a stalemate. Meanwhile, China and India had become the world's #1 and #3 annual climate carbon emitters. So this was huge between Barack Obama and President Xi Jinping. It set the stage then for moving to the success of the Paris Climate Accord. At the Lima conference, New York Times wrote this up. Without a deal, scientists say eventual human extinction is possible. The push to the Paris Climate Agreement was helped by the shoulder of Pope Francis in the Vatican, promulgating the Catholic Church's first ecologically centered encyclical. And that put it on the radar as a Catholic moral concern as well. It also just politically helped push the Paris Climate Accord. That achieved ratification in 2015. It was a long time coming, and the caps on carbon emissions were only voluntary, and there's no enforcement capability. It's a beginning. The US contribution, Obama's Clean Power Plan, that would set caps for every state, and the states would have the freedom to figure out how to achieve that cap, that limit. Republicans at the national level chose to, they're still in anything that will weaken Obama. They decide to fight the EPA on clean energy plan and to attack the Paris Accords. Really spurred by Mitch McConnell, who was the Senate Majority Leader from the great state of Kentucky, third largest coal producing state. Got to protect coal companies and the coal jobs. Messaging against Obama's war on coal. Republican candidate John McCain in 2008 spoke about the need to reduce America's carbon emissions. He held that climate change was an important concern. Mention of climate change in the was strong in the Republican Party platform that year. When Mitt Romney ran in 2012, there was little mention of climate change, and the party platform made no mention of climate change concerns. When Donald Trump ran in 2016, no climate change mention. There's vocal denial of the reality of climate change. The concept of climate warning in this tweet was buying for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. Climate change at the Republican national level, it's a non-issue. Mr. Trump told us on his inauguration day, we're going to cover our land from this day forward. It's going to be only America first. George Bush had some interesting reaction to the inaugural address. Big coal in Mr. Trump. Big oil in Mr. Trump. Trump chooses Rex Tillerson as his choice for Secretary of State. Exxon was partnering with Putin on Russian oil sales. Trump's speech in 2017 announcing that he's getting the US out of the Paris Climate Accord. He holds it's such a bad economic deal for the US and that other countries are laughing at us. Climate change is hardly mentioned in his speech. We recall the book Ghost written for Mr. Trump, The Art of the Deal. All about deals. Environmentalists pointed out climate change doesn't deal. The vision of a Green New Deal. The proposal of a Green New Deal in 2019 came from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Representative, and Senator Edward Markey, Democrat of Massachusetts. So New York and Massachusetts, you know, those elite East Coast states. Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Socialist, joined in the Green New Deal vision, engage climate change threat by ramping up funding for pushing solar, wind, and geothermal energy production, and push job creation and economic equity across our country. But it got stalled. Biden's Build Back Better bill contained a solid beginning, but a 50-50 Senate split meant that the Democrats needed all 50 senators to pass. Democratic senators, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, were not in favor, and that killed the Build Back Better bill. That same year that Biden's plan that was going to devote 550 billion to engage climate change. This was the largest ever federal proposal to push wind and solar energy production. So for that, you had 48 Democratic senators in favor, 0 Republican senators in favor. But when it came to military defense spending bill in December of 21, the Senate actually added billions on to what Biden had requested to send to him a $768 billion defense package. For this massive military defense spending bill, 44 Democratic senators were now suddenly joined by 47 Republican senators. Overwhelming. Pattern recognition. The Republican Party reframes ecological regulations as burdens and embraces climate change denial. In Nixon's time, it was a bipartisan concern. Then we see the Democrats seesaw back and forth across decades. Reagan began to pull the Republican Party into viewing ecological regulations as always bad for the economy. Then finally, Trump goes full-bore climate change denial and expresses love for coal and oil. US mobilization for World War II suggests how we could apply energy to mitigate climate change threat. Bill McKibben tells us in climate change, we see nature making war back on us. We're under attack from climate change, and our only hope is to mobilize like we did in World War II. Carbon and methane now represent the deadliest enemy of all time, the first force fully capable of harrying, scattering, and impoverishing our entire civilization. It's not that global warming is like a world war, it is a world war. Defeating the Nazis required more than brave soldiers. It required building big factories, building them really, really fast. Tom Brokaw called the World War II generation the greatest generation. Why? Well, they had serious leaders. They made serious sacrifices, and they paid the highest taxes. Building a military industrial complex, FDR reaches out to Bill Knudsen, president of General Motors, to get Knudsen to run the National Defense Advisory Commission. FDR is a New Deal president. Some called him socialist. He was for big government in the New Deal. A lot of governmental regulations that the corporate leaders distrusted, were not happy with. FDR's cabinet distrusted the big corporations, and his cabinet hated the corporate profits that flowed from World War I. Knudsen knew Detroit's industrial leaders, and he knew leaders across the country, and he knew who had crack engineering teams and who had idle factory capacity. Knudsen had a sense of urgency. This was going to be a joint venture between big government and big corporations. The sense of urgency came because he had just visited Europe to check up on General Motors factories, and he saw Germany's rush for war. He persuaded FDR to cut the process of seeking competitive bids from different companies. It's too slow. He persuaded FDR that if the government paid for the cost of any new needed factories, that would jumpstart corporate buy-in. He persuaded FDR to agree that the government would reimburse all corporate costs and guarantee on top of that a 7% profit. This was known as cost plus. Labor bought in as well, and it worked. Pearl Harbor added the jolt to action. Mobilization demanded mass industrial production. Detroit became the arsenal of democracy. Check out the light green line. That's our tank production during World War II. In 1941, basically 0 tanks produced. By 1942, the light green line tells us about 27,000 tanks are in production in the United States. In 1943, almost 38,000 tanks produced. That's how you win a war. World War II military spending surged to consume about 41 to 43% of our GDP. Why not mobilize it like this? US national defense spending as a percentage of US GDP. You see the peak in the war years of about 43%, but check 1950s and 60s. where military spending during the Cold War hovered between 10 and 12% of GDP. The nation applies energy. Mobilization costs money. FDR expands the tax base. FDR imposed the highest taxes on America's wealthy families. Highest marginal tax rate in US history of 94% in 1944 and 45. This rate kicked in when families' income above $250,000. In today's dollars, roughly $2 million. Justification? Well, we're drafting soldiers into combat, so drafting the wealth of America's richest families just seems kind of fair. Great chart. Top federal income tax for individuals. So you see, we kept it in the 90s for almost 20 years. Then it dropped down into the 70% tax bracket up through early 80s. And then Ronald Reagan dropped it precipitously. And then Democratic senators brought it back up somewhat, and then back down when Republicans came into office, and back up again in the Obama era, and then the drop to 37% recognizes Mr. Trump's tax cut that greatly benefited America's wealthy families and corporations. Corporate taxes, Mr. Trump dropped them to 21%. But you see, it's from an American economic prosperity across the 50s, 60s, 70s was significant. Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex. In a 1961 speech, he shone a light on the excessive military spending that's distorting America's funding priorities. We got to think of the military-industrial complex as an energy system of wants and needs and interests. His initial draft spoke of the military-industrial congressional complex. He was concerned that corporations' lust for profits and workers' desires for jobs and salaries, and representatives and senators' massive self-interest in their re-election combined to push hard for excessive military spending. But there are two Eisenhowers. The president who warns us in 61 of excessive military spending, but the earlier Supreme Allied Commander who embraced the military strength the military-industrial complex gave the Allies in that war. The two military-industrial complexes. The 19 military complex A, the World War II period, and military complex B, 1961, the entrenched joined interests of military corporations, labor, and congressional interests. The dynamics pushing military-industrial complex B, interest and greed, interests, self-interests. Interest and greed are also applied to energy. Current US military spending. One estimate puts it around $1 trillion a year. You total in all the components. The Nation magazine to 2019 concluded when you total in war budgets, nuclear budget, defense-related activities, homeland security, international intelligence agencies, it comes out to 1.25 trillion a year. Recent figures suggest the US spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined. So in absolute numbers, our spending is huge. But as a percentage of our huge gross domestic product, which stands today about 23 trillion, our military spending has shrunk down to below 4% of our GDP. Recent NATO estimates suggest US military spending stands about 3.5% of our GDP. Stockholm International Peace Research, highly reputable, holds it's about 3.7% of GDP. Proposal: America needs to energize a new climate security industrial complex. Lessons from both military complexes. One, from World War II, it's a model of big government, big corporate partnership. We also need government leadership and higher taxation. We need to incentivize major corporations, banks, insurance companies, and big unions to push for a Green New Deal. We must tap their lust for profits and workers' and voters' desire for jobs to lobby hard for lawmakers in Washington. An annual climate security mobilization budget should be pegged roughly at our current scale of our annual military spending. Annual military spending is about $1 trillion annually, and that's, when I do the numbers, that comes out to roughly 4.3% of GDP. So I'm going to take that more conservative figure, slightly higher percent of GDP. So if we add 1 trillion in a climate security budget to that, that would push our total national security spending to 8.6 of our GDP. We could easily reduce our military spending and reallocate it and put some toward climate security, but that's a tough sell. This security spending level is readily doable. The evidence, we did it already for decades. The current estimate of US GDP stands at 23 trillion. So when I add on the climate security budget, that brings the total to about 8.6% of GDP spent on total US security. How could we pay for this proposal? Look at history. We could return to the higher income tax and corporate tax levels that got us through World War II and the Cold War. Return to the 70s and earlier decades. This is what traditional view of national security looks like. And this is what an ecologically informed understanding of national security looks like. And this. We need a climate security industrial complex. Most of us following Eisenhower's warning are actually remain suspicious of the military industrial complex. His warning is relevant today, but we need to recall that in between 1940 and 45, building up the initial military industrial complex was critical in winning the war. It was a good lesson. The new climate security industrial complex would be a joint effort of government using tax policy to support corporations pushing solar, wind, geothermal power production and other measures. It would tap corporate, banking, insurance industry, and labor groups' incentives to push. Communication matters in politics. Green New Deal talk, I don't know, especially from the left wingers that are pushing it, is easily dismissed as socialist and naive. This climate security industrial complex triggers different associations. Each word triggers different associations. Security associates it with national security. Industrial associates it with the powerful vocabulary of manufacturing and jobs. Complex reminds us of the need to sustain political lobbying and pressure. The right wing is still applying energy and aiding and abetting carbon and methane in their attack. Sunday's New York Times, Republican effort to tilt courts against climate action reaches a crucial moment. Within days, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court is expected to hand down a decision that could severely limit the federal government's authority to reduce carbon dioxide from power plants, pollution that is dangerously heating the planet. But it's only a start. Some on the Supreme Court seem ready to attack the Chevron deference, namely that courts must defer to reasonable interpretations of legislated statutes, that agencies should have the authority to interpret. The conclusion, climate change is surely one of our top national security threats. America bears a huge burden of responsibility for cumulative historical contribution to global atmospheric carbon buildup. America is a great climate change perpetrator. We need to commit to the Paris Climate Accord's promises of supporting a climate finance fund to help developing nations. America has immense economic and cultural power, and to those to whom much has been given, much is required. It's time now for national applied energy. Thank you all very much.